Someone in Trouble. Chapter 21. Someone in Trouble. All was quiet and calm in LazyTown that night. The streets were empty and the holes had been filled in on the road. Stingy's car had been buffed and polished back to its full glory, and sat parked peacefully by the brick wall. Nobody stirred, everyone sleeping soundly in their homes. Almost everyone, anyway. Deep underground, alone in his lair, Robbie Rotten was having a nightmare. His head tossed from side to side, his hands clenched into fists, and his legs twitched and fidgeted. Flashes of the day's events kept filling his head in a discomforting jumble. Baiting kids with candy, cars crashing into pitfalls, computers blaring and smoking, chasing children with nets and getting whacked with ladders, faces full of fear twisting with shock and dismay, maybe even hatred. High-pitched panic turning into angry overtones and harsh words as everyone disavowed themselves of Robbie and his friendship, forsaking him, and good riddance to him. Who needs him? Nobody. Robbie gasped so loudly that he startled himself out of his restless dreams. But waking up couldn't help him to escape his unpleasant reality. His head pounded from exhaustion. His body was bruised and battered from his last defeat, and he was so tired, but he just couldn't sleep. He found it hard to breathe in the confines of his bunker. Everything he'd done, everything that had happened, was suffocating him. He needed some air. He needed to get out. High in the sky, alone in his airship, Sportacus was still awake, even well after it was 8:08. Where he would normally fall quickly to sleep once settled under his comforter, as white and fluffy as a cloud, this time a brainstorm was raging in his head. He had a lot to think about from that afternoon. The party had been put together hastily and was fun for the most part. The kids wanted to know all about what Sportacus had been doing the past few weeks, and for him to show off some new moves that he'd learned along the way. He was happy to regale them with his adventures and entertain them with his physical feats. When Sportacus asked what all the kids had been up to in return, what he got was more than he ever could have expected. Stories about Robbie pulling the biggest largemouth bass on record, Robbie and Trixie terrorizing the town with their pranks and mischief, Robbie beating the hardest level on Pixel's favorite video game but accidentally crashing the system before he could enter his initials into the high scoreboard. Reliving those times put obvious excitement on the children's faces as they laughed over all the ways that they and Robbie had filled the days. And in the immediate wake of all those happy memories, each child caught themselves laughing and subdued themselves, wiping tears of mirth from their eyes, clearing their throats, and falling silent until the next story bubbled up out of them in spite of themselves. For all the cake and sports candy set out, it was a bittersweet celebration. A sudden and sharp series of rapid beeps startled Sportacus into sitting straight up in his bed. When he threw back his comforter, a bright light pulsed out and filled the airship with a strange and soft glow. He stared down at his chest where his crystal rang and flashed. Someone's in trouble? Sportacus couldn't imagine what sort of trouble anyone could get into this late at night. Jumping to his feet, he strode across deck to investigate by means of door. The door dropped down into a platform for the man to step out into the cold night air. Sportacus pulled out his spyglass and combed over the dark roofs of the town, looking for what could be amiss. Everywhere he looked, there was nothing to suggest a problem. All windows were dark, the townspeople safe inside and asleep. What was wrong? He almost missed it on his first pass and had to take a double look. Way out on the outskirts of town, there on the billboard, was a dark spot, just a shade off from the rest of the gloomy surroundings. Sitting precariously on top of the sign was none other than Robbie Rotten. Sportacus squinted uncertainly into the spyglass as he studied the man. Was he stuck? He wasn't moving much. It was hard to tell if he was even awake or not, with his head drooping down into his chest. The sight was familiar to Sportacus, only this time there was no rabid robotic dog on the loose to explain what had gotten Robbie up there. It felt a bit strange to go check on the town's resident villain after just foiling one of his nefarious plots earlier that same day. There was nobody else around who seemed to be in need of help, though. He would just drop in and see that everything was all right. Maybe then he would be able to get some rest. Hunkered down like a gargoyle, Robbie didn't notice the airship, silently skimming to a halt overhead. Numbed by the cold as he was, he didn't react to a spindly rope ladder unfurling nearby either. It wasn't until Sportacus had climbed down part way and jumped the rest of the way to land solidly on the narrow edge of the billboard that Robbie realized he wasn't alone. The shuddering of the metal frame and the sudden appearance of the blue elf shocked a strangled yelp out of Robbie and made him nearly jump out of his skin. He teetered on the billboard, starting to fall backwards right off of the thing. Sportacus grabbed the man by the arm and pulled him back. "Whoa there," Sportacus said. Once Robbie had his hands clenched securely on some of the supporting struts of the billboard, Sportacus released him. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you." I wasn't startled," Robbie snapped. He couldn't hold Sportacus's gaze, only deigning to give the intruder of his solitude side-eyed glances. "What are you even doing out here? You can't wake up this early." With a soft chuckle, Sportacus gestured at his chest. His crystal was still flashing, blinking in and out like a beacon. The two men watched it together, equally perplexed. "I thought maybe you were stuck," Sportacus suggested. "No," Robbie corrected him. He turned his head away, clearly uncomfortable under the helpful hero's attention. He muttered something under his breath. "Well, maybe." "Why don't I give you a hand, then?" Sportacus extended his arm. Robbie flinched away from the action and shook his head. "I'm not stuck like that," he growled, and cleared his throat. I mean to be out here. Haven't you ever heard of someone going out in the middle of the night to stargaze?" "Really?" Sportacus raised his eyebrows at this. How could anyone expect to have any energy in the morning if they stayed up all night? But he held his tongue on the lecture and surprised both of them by asking instead, "Do you mind if I join you?" Robbie opened his mouth, but no words came out. He didn't know how to refuse at this point. When he found his voice again, all he could muster was a gruff, "Suit yourself." "Thanks," Sportacus said. With a hop, he dropped down to sit on the edge of the billboard, dangling his legs over the side. Robbie jerked and tensed at his brief athletic outburst before settling back down. So they sat like that. Robbie had never seen Sportacus so still before, and he kept glancing over at him suspiciously for it. Who would ever believe that LazyTown's slightly above-average hero and its villain would sit together, looking up at the stars. The moment was both surreal and awkward. It didn't help that Sportacus's crystal persisted in glowing even now. "Can't you turn that thing off?" Robbie finally asked. Sportacus cupped a hand over his prized possession to obstruct some of the light pollution, but shook his head. "It beeps when there's trouble," Sportacus said, "but I can't figure out where it is." He looked carefully at Robbie. "Are you sure you don't need any help?" "I said I'm fine," Robbie asserted sourly. He tried to turn it around on the man. "Maybe you should look out for yourself. Doesn't that flashy noisemaker ever go off for you?" Sportacus looked intrigued by the proposition and looked up towards his airship to mull it over. The pensive silence was no more comfortable than the one before. Eventually, Sportacus tried to laugh it off. "What kind of trouble could I get into?" he asked. "I only ever have to save everyone else, not myself." "That's right," Robbie said. "And if nobody needed you to save them anymore, wouldn't that be trouble for you?" "Well, maybe... no." Sportacus settled on rejecting the idea. "It would be better if nobody needed saving, wouldn't it? I would rather that no one needed me if it meant they had to be in trouble for me to be of use." Something in the man's tone tickled Robbie's ear. Was it a hint of sadness? Sportacus glanced over at Robbie and caught his shifty eye before he could avoid it. "Actually," Sportacus confided in him, "to tell you the truth—" The man paused, drumming his fingers nervously on the billboard. Robbie held his breath without even realizing, waiting for him to go on. "Today," Sportacus said, "I would not have even been able to save everyone when they needed me." He glanced down at his crystal, giving it a gentle rap with his knuckles. "My crystal never beeped all afternoon. The only reason I knew there was trouble was because of the letter I got warning me." Sportacus dug into one of his pockets, rooting around until he pulled out a folded up and crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, letting the light from his crystal illuminate the badly scrawled note. Robbie sat still as a statue. Eventually the sports elf chuckled. "It's funny. I asked all the kids about it, and none of them say they wrote it." He grinned wryly up at the stars. "Maybe they weren't in trouble after all." "How should I know?" Robbie mumbled. The night air was starting to make his skin burn from the chilly bite. It was causing all sorts of strange reactions in him. His throat felt a little dry and his pulse was just a little too fast for sitting still. He could even feel a bead of sweat run down the side of his neck. Sportacus let out another chuckle. Neither of them were going to say it. Robbie didn't want to give either of them the chance to change their minds. "It doesn't matter anyway," Robbie said. "You're back now, and you probably got a stinkin' trophy just for showing up. I bet you missed all the hero worship." "I guess there is part of me that likes to be the hero everyone likes me to be," Sportacus said carefully. "I missed being here to save everyone, sure, but mostly—" Again, Robbie heard that particular tone in Sportacus's voice, a melancholic chord. "I missed all of my friends here the most. It was hard not having these friends when I couldn't be their hero." He shrugged helplessly. but at least they had you. Robbie wanted to feel victorious. After suffering all of his own disappointments and defeats, it was gratifying to hear undeniable proof that he had managed to injure his mortal enemy. He had truly gotten the better of Sportacus, if only for a while. Rather than reveling in his silent success, Robbie scoffed in the sports elf's face. "Do you really believe that you're only a friend to those brats as long as you're saving them?" Sportacus furrowed his brow in a strange look at Robbie. He didn't seem sure how to answer. "Of course you're not!" Robbie exclaimed. "Those kids were completely lost without you. They missed you so much. It was pathetic, really." He rolled his shoulders in a reflexive twitch and challenged Sportacus. "And do you really think that someone like me could replace you?" He spat off the side of the billboard. "Entirely out of the question. I would never dream of doing all those horrible sports games or eating sports candy that those nasty children love so much, no matter how much they wanted me to. In fact," Robbie found the words pouring out of him now, the dam broken, "it's been a lot harder around LazyTown since you've been gone." "Really?" Sportacus asked softly, almost scandalized. "Robbie, did you miss me?" "What? No!" Robbie sputtered and stammered. "I was just saying it's been hard. Being the hero for these kids is too much work for one simple rotten guy. It's so tiring having to do all that saving and being on the alert every waking moment." Again, Robbie found he couldn't stop the words tumbling out of his mouth as he unloaded on the man. "I never get any peace and quiet anymore with everyone wanting a piece of me all the time. And besides, it's just more fun to be the bad guy," he declared. "I miss wearing my disguises and tricking those simple-minded fools and doing things just for me. How am I supposed to be able to do that if there isn't someone here to pick up the slack for me, I ask you?" The more excuses Robbie spouted, the more Sportacus's face started to shift into a grin, his mustache tweaking and his eyes lighting up. When Robbie had finally vented all he could, he fell silent, clamping his mouth shut. A pregnant pause developed between them. Quietly, Sportacus said, "Maybe we are both in trouble, after all." Robbie snorted at this. "How much trouble is it for you to know that the whole town missed you and wants you to stay?" He crossed his arms tight over his chest. "It should be simple enough for you to go back to being everyone's hero, and I—" He coughed. "Well, I'm fine on my own. The kids already hate me again, so that's not so hard." "It's not that simple," Sportacus denied him. Robbie ground his teeth together. "And why not?" he asked. With just a touch of amusement, Sportacus said, "I think the kids like you more than you give them credit for. They missed you a lot today. If you go back to your old ways, it will just make them more sad." "Yeah, well," Robbie grumbled, his shoulders hunching up around his ears. "Whatever." "I missed you too, Robbie." Robbie jerked his head in the elf's direction, his eyes almost bugging out. The villain's face went a full shade darker than normal. "You are just as crazy as the rest of those kids, Sportacook." "It doesn't have to be like this," Sportacus insisted. "The kids don't want only me or only you. They like us both. If we're both in the same trouble, can't we find a way to solve it together?" Robbie looked hard at Sportacus for a long moment, meeting his gaze for the first time. In the intermittent glow of the crystal, the shadows under his eyes made him look more daunting and intimidating than he ever had before. But Sportacus didn't shrink away. Finally, Robbie spoke again. "Why are you always so nice to me?" he asked. "What are you talking about?" Sportacus asked. Robbie gave a shake of his head, letting out a small growl. "Don't play stupid with me. It's always been obvious that I don't like you. I've tried to trap you, to sabotage you, to run you out of town." He admitted to it all without a hint of guilt or shame. They were just the facts. "We have nothing in common that could make us friends, so stop pretending already." "That's not true," Sportacus protested. "We do have something in common." "Oh yeah?" Robbie asked dryly. "What would that be?" "It's simple," Sportacus said. "We both care about LazyTown." Robbie stared at Sportacus. "What?" "We might care about it and show it in different ways," Sportacus forged ahead. "But that's what it comes down to, isn't it? We both want what's best for this town and the people in it. And for you, of all people, to say that it's better for LazyTown if I stay, well, you must care very much about it." "If you want what's best for this town," Robbie said in a low voice, "why haven't you ever tried to get rid of me?" "You do stir up a lot of trouble," Sportacus conceded, but as he spoke it was almost with fondness rather than fury. "You try to lead the kids astray and make them lazy. Sometimes you can be just plain difficult." "Go on, don't let me stop you," Robbie grumbled. "But I would never want you to leave, Robbie," Sportacus said. "I'm not trying to stop anyone from ever having any sweets or being a little lazy sometimes. I just want everyone to be as happy as they can be, and the best way I know how to do that is to help them be active and eat right." "It seems to me, though," the elf deduced slyly, "you've found other ways how everyone can be happier too, and not just by eating cake and sleeping all day. Isn't that right?" "We may have found a few things to do," Robbie said, avoiding Sportacus's eye again. He had become very fidgety in the past few minutes. "I think the best thing for LazyTown," Sportacus proposed, "is to have both of us here. What do you think about that?" Robbie mulled it over, somewhat disdainful of the elf's unfailingly optimistic outlook, but resigning himself to the possibility. He'd already accepted that he couldn't get rid of Sportacus, not again. Maybe the town could be big enough for the both of them. "That doesn't mean," Robbie said, expressing one last shred of resistance, "that I'm just going to sit by quietly every time you turn this place upside down into a noisy and hyper crazy town." "That's fair," Sportacus said, his smile audible in his tone. "It's good for everyone to know how to relax sometimes. But I can't stand by when the kids start to eat themselves sick or go stiff from lying around all day doing nothing either." "That's fair," Robbie agreed more reluctantly. They sized each other up one last time. Sportacus extended his hand to the villain. The occasion didn't seem to call for anything as overly intimate as a hug, but Robbie found himself slowly reciprocating in a firm handshake. He managed not to wince in the elf's strong grip. It didn't really hurt that much, and his fingers only throbbed a little when the man let go of him. It's pretty late, Sportacus said. He jumped up onto his feet and balanced on the billboard once again. We should both get some sleep. Have a good night, Robbie. Sportacus, wait, Robbie blurted as the blue-clad man reached out to grab the rope ladder that would take him back up into his airship. There is one more thing. Oh? Sportacus paused with one foot on the ladder, looking back. What is it? Meekly, Robbie held out his hand to the elf again. Do you think you could help me get down from here? He asked. Sportacus's expression broke into a broad smile, and he laughed. Are you sure you need my help? He asked, and gestured at his chest. I mean, look, my crystal isn't beeping anymore.